Today's gospel lesson comes from John's gospel, the most mystical of the 4 stories about Jesus' ministry on earth. For us modern readers, we must remember that finding John's real meaning often entails looking deeply into the text, listening to the subtle nuances John weaves through his writing. It also means that John did not necessarily present all the events he recounts in strictly chronological order. When in the course of this story, as told by the other gospel writers, we'd be hearing about Jesus' cleansing of the temple, John tells that story a little earlier, and today's passage instead starts with a reference to Greeks, Gentiles who were in town to see the festivities of Passover, and they wanted to see Jesus. You know, they wanted to have a few words with this new celebrity. I wasn't there in Jerusalem that day, of course, but all this talk about crowds trying to get to Jesus can't help but make me think of the first inauguration of President Barack Obama, when Washington, D.C. was crushed with crowds like that city had never seen before. I was there, and that day, mixed in with the rest of us normal people, there were lots of celebrities. In fact, the night before the inauguration, I had dinner with some friends in the very same restaurant where Bruce Springsteen was eating dinner with his family. Like the ambitious Greeks who approached Philip, some of the ambitious members of our group approached the maitre d' to ask if we could just see Bruce Springsteen in person. Alas, no luck. We didn't have an inn like the Greeks in John's account did. You'll notice they approached Philip first out of all the disciples in Jesus' inner circle. Philip is a Greek name, so while Philip was a Jew for sure, he grew up in a region where many Greeks lived and presumably would have at least listened to those who approached him. Remember, there were thousands and thousands of people descending on Jerusalem for Passover. Naturally, there would have been tourists in town to join the party. Even if they were not devout Jews, they would come to the temple. And the temple was the center of all the action, so it certainly would have been a stop on the Gentile holiday tour of Jerusalem. Gentiles couldn't go into the temple. That would defile a holy place. Instead, they could stand outside and take a look at all the festivities in an outside area called the Court of the Gentiles. This, by coincidence, also happened to be the unclean place where those who sold animals and traded money would hang out, making it very likely the place that Jesus walked into, got mad, and made a scene. You can imagine, with all the people in town, that the story of the Jewish rabbi who came into the court of the Gentiles and chastised the religious establishment for exploitation of the poor would have spread like wildfire all over the place. Everybody knew what Jesus had done, and if he was a celebrity before, this took things to a whole new level. They all wanted to talk to Jesus. And it's when they finally make it to Jesus that we hit on the heart of this passage, where Jesus is facing a tough decision, maybe tougher than any other up until this point. While he's been pretty frank with them up until now, Jesus clearly can tell that the tide is turning, and it's likely that the ultimate act of defiance, death, is not too far off for him. It's time to speak plainly to the group listening, to talk about what is at the very core of this defiant living Jesus is inviting all of them to embark on. You and me, we're fast approaching Holy Week, where we tell the story again of Jesus' suffering and death. But let's be honest, we're 21st century Americans who live in a society very tolerant, often endorsing of the beliefs that we claim to hold dear. We know that Jesus died, and we know that many around the world today die for what they believe. But we learn early, death is bad, and we'd like to avoid it at all costs. Our purpose on earth is not to give ourselves up to die, but instead to preserve as much life as we possibly can. We don't generally give very much thought to how we'll die. And it's in front of this slick, modern backdrop that we hear again these shocking words of Jesus. Listen carefully. Unless a grain of wheat is buried in the ground, dead to the world, it's never any more than a grain of wheat. But if it's buried, it sprouts and reproduces itself many, many times over. In the same way, anyone who holds on to life just as it is destroys that life. But if you let it go, reckless in your love, you'll have it forever, real and eternal. So what are we, people intent on self-preservation, both on an instinctual evolutionary level and on a modern societal level, to do when we hear Jesus' defiant invitation to come and die? Maybe we'll be defiant along with Jesus up until a certain point, and then we'll just leave the dying to him? No, I don't think so. I hate to say it, but I really don't think so. See, following Jesus is not a nice hobby we pursue in our free time. And if we're serious about being followers, then dying for what we believe is going to be a very real part of our lives. I wonder if perhaps the way this passage in John is framed gives us some way to get a handle on this radical insistence of Jesus that dying must become part of our lives if our faith is going to mean anything. Take a look. It's quite interesting that Jesus speaks the hardest, most unrelenting words about following when the disciples, the ones who had definite, certain expectations and ideas about who he was, were faced with some unclean Gentiles making a request to see Jesus. Jesus knew that their old way of thinking about their lives had to die. Their sure understanding of God, the one they knew by heart and would never dare to question, had to die. Their convictions about what role they would play in this kingdom Jesus kept talking about had to die. Their preconceived ideas of people who were different were going to have to die, and even their old ideas about religion, gender, social class, everything they knew about enemies and material wealth and what it was they thought for sure they needed to survive, all of it had to die in order for all that God wanted to create in them to be born. What are the things in you and me that must die? If we're really serious about following Jesus, this radical, defiant one who challenged every part of what we know and who we are, what in us must die? I think that Jesus' invitation to the crowd that day and Jesus' invitation to us is the same. Come and die. Come and find out what it is in your life that is limiting your view of what God dreams for you and for this world. Take a good, hard look and start where you are. Turn to the Greek standing next to you, I imagine he might have said, and die to your old prejudices that keep you from community. Look over there at the temple, that symbol of religious institutions that have lost their way and are now in the business of excluding people who don't belong, and die to your former ideas about the limitations of God's love. Think for a minute about God and everything you know God to be, and die to the compulsion to place God neatly in a box of your own making. I think that Jesus knew that if the crowd was able to step out in faith to start dying, even in these little ways, then, like a seed that is planted in the ground and dies, the potential for new life multiplies beyond what we ever imagined. Little by little, one death after another, we put aside our allegiance to self-preservation, whatever it may be. idealistic, spiritual, physical, national even, and we make room for God's new creation in us. And then, if the day ever comes that we are asked to hand over our very lives, we will then be people who know with the deepest conviction what it is we believe, what it is we would in fact die for. Because as Jesus knew, once we really and truly know what it is we would die for, we become people who can more fully live into a human life filled with defiance. Defiant belief that this kingdom of heaven Jesus talked about might actually be born in us and produce seed after seed after seed of kingdom living that would little by little change the world. We begin this week a move toward Palm Sunday, next Sunday, and then the descent into darkness, when Jesus lived out in radical defiance just what he talked about in our gospel passage today. And so as you and I prepare to move forward into this week, I want to invite you, just try. Imagine yourself standing in the dusty crowd outside the temple that day. Try to hear all the noise around you. Smell the animals and the crowds. Strain to make out the ridiculous words you thought you heard Jesus say. And identify the uneasiness you feel standing in that crowd. There are people or things surrounding you that are keeping you from following Jesus with defiance and abandon. They could be ideas or convictions or attitudes. So start here. Take a good look around and hear these hard words. I want to follow Jesus with defiance and conviction. My faith has to really mean something. Wanting to be a follower so desperately, I wonder, what in me needs to die today? Amen.